Hi, I'm Liam Dann. Welcome to Money Talks, a podcast about our relationship with money. We're not going to tell you how to get rich, and we're not going to try and pick the next interest rate move. In this series, I talk to interesting New Zealanders about how money has shaped their lives. With me today, I have former Prime Minister, Sir John Key. Hi, John. Welcome to Money Talks. It is Sir John, isn't it?
Well, it's John. John's going to work perfectly well.
I was going to say, most New Zealanders aren't too big on the honorifics, I guess.
No, it would be a very long podcast if we're having to use all those things I've got around my name. So let's just sit with John and work well.
Great. Look, but it would be worth, I think, just touching on what you've been up to. I know, obviously, chair of ANZ for New Zealand is a big job, but what else? What are the other boards that you're involved with in the business world right now?
Yeah, so I do a bunch of different things. I guess, when I retired from politics, I decided, look, I don't want to go back and be so tied up that I run something, all day and it consumes, a full sort of working week, if you like. And I was kind of interested in doing things across the globe because I had a capacity to sort of do that. So, yeah, I'm chairman of ANZ in New Zealand, and I'm on ANZ's group board. I am an advisor to Comcast, so we're the largest cable and broadcasting company in the world. I own NBC and Universal Studios, all that sort of stuff. I'm on BP's advisory board in London, so that sort of keeps me very busy. I'm on Palo Alto Networks board, so we're the largest cybersecurity company in the world. And then also locally, I advise Zespri. I'm the sort of China expert, if you like, for Zespri. So a bunch of sort of different things, but all of them interesting and unique in their own right.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really big stuff there. One of the ones that you've taken on more recently is the Crimson Consulting education services. That's very much at the different end of the spectrum in terms of being a startup. What sort of drew you in there?
Yeah, well, I kind of knew Jamie Beaton because my son went to school with Jamie. And, it's hard to miss Jamie. He's probably the second brightest New Zealander after Rutherford. I think you've got to have Rutherford at number one. I mean, Jamie has to split the atom last time I looked, but he's a phenomenally bright guy, which is actually why nowadays the late Julian Robertson backed him, obviously, at Tiger. And he's a remarkable young man and building a really, really impressive and interesting company. It started life as a kind of mentoring service, if you like, for parents to be able to work out how to send their child to an Ivy League university, primarily in the United States. But now it's very much online learning and they have a bunch of different offerings. And, yeah, he's just a different thinker. And I think really if you boil it all down, what's it all about? I mean, it's really about saying we have a one-size-fits-all policy for education. Look, it works pretty well for a lot of people. But some people want to go a lot faster, some maybe a little slower, some doing different disciplines at different rates. And that's really what he's kind of believed in. How can we really push the envelope? And, I think in a highly competitive world where New Zealanders really do have, young New Zealanders are going to have global optionality available to them. Why wouldn't they want to, go at a pace that might be a bit quicker than what they get through the current New Zealand education system?
Sure. Look, I might come back to a bit of that because it is interesting to talk about how we can use education to sort of push the wealth of the nation, I guess. But can I jump back to the very beginning and ask you a question I ask everyone on this podcast, which is, what's your first memory of money, of holding it in your hands, as a child?
I think two things. One was getting pocket money, and I'm pretty sure it was 50 cents actually, and losing it once, and that seemed fairly horrendous. And then the other thing was, believe it or not, and this will sound so incredibly old-fashioned, as chairman of ANZ, I can tell you it's very old-fashioned. My mother, when I was about 7 or 8, took me along to meet the bank manager of what was actually the CFB, and that was because she had borrowed money to buy a house, and she said, look, you have to know the bank manager because that's how you're going to, do that. And she was absolutely desperate for me to be an accountant. Yeah. And so she thought, well, the bank manager, that's got to be the most important accountant in her mind that she knew. And so she wanted me to basically meet him and role model myself on the bank manager at the branch in Brynwa. So that was the history there.
Did it have an impact? I mean, I guess your mother was probably wanting to be sure that you had financial security.
Yeah, no, look, in fact, actually, years later, I used to say to my mother, hey, she used to say to me, she'd say, money doesn't bring happiness. And I used to go, it sure as hell helps. And I kind of stick with my view. I think it does help. But yeah, it was interesting because she had been this Austrian Jewish refugee that sort of got out when the Nazis invaded, and because she'd come from a wealthy family actually to effectively no resources at all, because she, ended up in London pre-World War II, not being able to speak English, with her brother and with no financial resources. She had learnt that life can throw up these incredible things, really, and circumstances that you can never imagine. And I think it's what you see. You often see people, for instance, they'll be a married couple with a family, they're doing well, they've got a business, and all of a sudden, the business goes to the wall and their whole life is thrown upside down, and they're having to cope with circumstances they'd never even envisaged. And most people want to aspire to have money. So for her, it was a really important part of it. And even for me, I was obviously really interested in politics, but I had it ingrained in me, hey, you're going to go out and you're going to make some money and you're going to be financially independent. And when you've done that, then you can indulge yourself and do something different. It was just a way of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, did that sort of inform the choice to do commerce at university?
Yeah, for sure. Look, it's a bit of a kind of slightly funny story in a way, but I had a friend, and the friend's uncle was a great horse trainer in Christchurch, and I got quite interested in this. And look, if I'm really honest, him and I were much more interested in backing these horses and mucking out the sort of pens, if you like. But anyway, I sort of, started doing some work out there. And anyway, as you do when you're 15 years of age, I came home one day to declare to my mother I was leaving school and that I was going to work for the horse trainer. Well, that conversation lasted, about as long, actually, I've got to say, as the KiwiSaver GST tax the other day. It was sort of, to quote Don Brash, gone by lunchtime.
Yeah.
And so, no, that was definitely not what was happening.
Yep.
And my mother declared to me, well, you might think you're doing that, but actually you're going to university to be an accountant, and you're going to have this financial security and a job. And actually, even, and I went and did that. I did do a lot. I have a lot of economics in my degree, but basically I've got an accounting degree. And even then, I went and started work for effectively what was Deloitte. It was called McCulloch Menzies back then. And I did that because, even though I could have probably explored lots of other job opportunities and I really didn't want to be a chartered accountant, I thought, wow, I've really got to do, Mum had sort of ingrained in me, I've got to get this job and start working. So, and I think, is she unique? Maybe her background was a little unique, coming obviously out of Austria and all those kind of things, and Jewish matriarchal mother, but I reckon those conversations happen still every day around New Zealand, where parents worry about the futures of their children and about their financial security and their own financial security. And, money really matters. Like, nothing terrifies people more than maybe they'll run out of money and they'll be in their retirement or and when you think about divorce, I remember being Prime Minister and seeing these graphs of people's financial wealth or otherwise, and a remarkable number of people have low amounts of money. Like, I think at ANZ, 40% of our customers went into COVID-19 with $5,000 or less in the bank. It doesn't mean they don't have other assets, but they had very low cash balances. And I just think, it really worries them that and this graph shows there's this dramatic, people have negative assets when they're very young, primarily because they have a student loan, and then in their 40s and 50s, a lot of them have negative assets or very low levels of assets, and it's as a result of divorce. Yeah,
it's very, very expensive business.
It's very expensive and real, So money matters, it matters.
Yeah, and did you feel poor growing up? I mean, it was a different New Zealand, I guess. There wasn't so many places to spend money.
Yeah, look, okay, and my son actually asked me that question the other day. He sort of said, because, he's grown up in a well-off background and pretty privileged background in many respects, and he can't imagine. I would say to him, look, you got to put yourself in my shoes, I think, look, and so I tell you what it felt like. It didn't feel like, there was never a situation where we couldn't eat or there wasn't that something. did I get Christmas presents to the best of my memory? Yeah. Mum did everything she could to. There was a lot of love in the house and a lot of everything good actually. But truthfully, we grew up in the state house, and did I go to other friends' houses and notice that their houses were cool and ours wasn't? Truthfully, yeah. And it's interesting with my son. He said to me the other day, he said, "Why do you bother working? Like, we don't need any more money. You know, why don't you just play golf and fly helicopters and do whatever you want to do all the time?" And I said, well, partly it's intellectual stimulation, and I enjoy it. You know, although I don't want to die working or anything. I mean, I'm seriously, I'm happy to retire and things. But I guess there's part of me that just feels that I should just keep working just to make sure, you know, it's a funny thing with money, you know, and I'm not a slave to it, because if I was, I wouldn't have effectively not really earned a huge amount of money in the context of what I was earning. In 15 odd years I was in politics. But yeah, even I sort of sit there and think, I probably should earn money because I can. I probably should, you know.
Yeah, but it does go to the fact that money, you know, once you've got that security, and I think this was something you said once about defining wealth as not having to worry about the fridge or the car breaking down or whatever. But once you've got that sorted, you sort of do realise that there is more than the money behind the work, right? You've got to, stay intellectually engaged at some level.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, money is initially working is about money and putting food on the table and shelter and Maslow's hierarchy of needs and all that sort of stuff. But actually the reality is, there's so many other things that come out of that. And it's that connectivity. And it's going to be one of the really interesting things, I think, when one day we explore what the future of work looks like post the COVID world. And I reckon it'll be a hybrid world, but I reckon the reason that people will drift back actually to work is because, particularly for young people, they learn by osmosis, they learn by being there, and they want to be noticed. And actually working off the end of their bedroom in some grotty flat somewhere probably isn't that seductive an idea anyway. So I actually reckon people do morph back to bricks and mortars, not in totality, but more than what some other people might think.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about that I noticed when I was just doing some research was that I think it was your second job was project manager at Lane Walker Rudkins. Yeah. What were you managing there?
Yeah, what was I thinking? So what happened was, but having said that, I went to be a chartered accountant because Mum wanted me because I thought I should. One thing I confirmed very early on was that I actually didn't want to be a chartered accountant. Funny enough, my boss, who's a lovely guy, at the time, it was the audit partner. He was quite young, actually, when you think back on it. I mean, I was 21, and he was actually in his late 30s, I think, and he was young. But I mean, when I was there, I felt old as me, like anyone does, And I'd been in the job for about 3 or 4 months, and I sat next to him, and I said to him, and we were having a beer one night after work, and I said, "Do you really enjoy this?" And he said, "Do you want me to be honest?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Oh, God, no. It's quite dull." And I said, "Why on earth do you do it?" And he said, "Well, because I've got a little farm out in Templeton, and I really like horses and I like all these things, and the job just pays for the other things I want to do." And Brona and I weren't married there, but I went home and I said, "God, I can't spend the next 40 years of my life doing something I don't really want to do because it pays the bills. It's got to be better than this." And my sister worked for Lane Walker Rudkin, and I was having this discussion with her one night, and she said, "You should meet this guy called Dave Phillipson, really lovely guy, South LWR, international, all the rugby jerseys and all that stuff."
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I grew up in Christchurch as well, so for people who didn't, Lane Walker Rudkins was big business in Canterbury.
It was
at the time.
Christchurch, it was everything really, And so I met him and he offered me this job and I thought, what the hell? So I went and I did all sorts of really fascinating projects. Like we had this, one thing that you probably know this, but in men's fashion, we get attracted when we see a shop window that's got gold and red and white and all this sort of stuff in it, and we don't buy any of it, by the way. We buy navy, grey, black, right? So anyway, what happens is these designers would design all these, incredible bloody, ranges and all these colours. And we had one particular designer who went nuts doing this. And I walked in one day and Dave Phillipson said to me, who was my boss, he said, we have got a warehouse full of this stuff. And there was no, in those days, no outlets, there was no internet. He said, your number one job is to get this thing is written off, get rid of it. And so I went off to England and I found this guy who was like an Arthur Daly kind of character. And we sold the entire warehouse, which honestly was tens of millions of dollars worth of stuff. And it all went to Poland and Eastern Europe.
Oh, wow.
They're all running around in red shorts, so they're probably still wearing them. But anyway, we got rid of it. So it was quite interesting.
Yeah, it just struck me. It's funny because it was a good company, and
it was a good company.
In some ways, the story of State House to Prime Minister is quite well told. But from Lane Walker Rudkin's project manager to head of trading at Merrill Lynch is actually kind of quite a big stretch. You obviously that was a stepping stone, I guess.
Yeah. Well, what happened was there was this program once. I mean, as you probably know, doing the rounds on the internet has been for years. Is this, day in the life of the foreign exchange?
Yes, have seen that.
Yep. And the glasses and the whole nine yards and all merchant finance and
just pre-crash, wasn't it? Pre 1987. The real all the cliches of stockbrokers and currency traders.
Me and the BMW in the tiny little dealing room, and the reenacted waking up at 4 a.m. to get the phone call. Anyway. There was a program once, and it was on TV, and it was effectively the same thing, day in the life of the foreign exchange dealer. And it had this guy, Alan Cole. He was the main guy. And we were watching TV this night, Brona and I. We were married by then. And I looked at this thing, and Roger Douglas had deregulated the financial markets. And he was this kind of guy doing this foreign exchange and the noise and the everything, the whole, they say all the cliches, the long lunches and the, And I looked at Brona and I said, I could do this. And she said, oh, we should give it a go then. And I wrote off to two organisations, to DFC and I think to BNZ. And DFC, the old Development Finance Corporation, rang back and said, come to Wellington on Friday. And They offered me a job. And they offered me a job and I wanted to be a trader, and they offered me a job as a financial sales guy. I said, no, but I want to be a trader. And they said, no. And I turned them down. And they said, you're crazy. You lost your mind. If you do this, then you can transition. And they were right, actually. I did lose my mind. I should have done it. Yeah. But in the end, I said no. And I didn't go there. But about 3 or 4 months later, I decided I was wrong. And I went in Australia, and I went initially to Elders Merchant Finance, who were in Australia, but they sent me to pretty much run New Zealand or be a big part of New Zealand. And so then they fired a few people and I became the boss. So that was the plot of history.
I mean, you did seem to. I mean, it seemed to really thrive in that world of currency trading. Can I talk a bit about that? I mean, that is the sort of heart of the money machine of the world, the currency markets. And I just wondered what you thought about the way that money works there. Is trading an art or a science? Because people, one thing I've sort of learned is that you can have all the economic data in the world, but you're not going to predict the future, and you're not going to get rich unless you act and take risk at some point. I mean, there's some sort of knack or art to doing this, isn't there?
Yeah, it's art. Look, it's totally art. It's not science. So there's two things. Firstly, one was that banks, and particularly dealing rooms, are the barometer of world events. And it doesn't really matter whether it's the space shuttle blowing up or some Scud missile going into a war zone or, Princess Diana passing away. It doesn't matter what the global event is. And some of them can be, very mundane things like, money supply, release of data. They have it. They're measured against exchange rates, and they flow through that sort of melting pot. And so, firstly, they're fascinating because everything is analysed here. So that's one thing. And for years, on the sort of ladder, for the years, I was a very instinctive kind of trader. And probably, truthfully, if I'm Prime Minister, I'm an instincts kind of guy. I mean, as I sort of said when I was leaving, when they asked me what advice I'd give Bill, was kind of trust your instincts. And even if you get it, like if you don't trust your instincts and you get it wrong, you're always second guessing yourself. Whereas if you trust your instincts and, hey, you make the wrong decision, well, okay, you'll work it out. But more often than not, you'll actually be right. And so I used to have a lot of trainees sit next to me, and they used to say to me, why are you buying? And I'd say, well, it's going up. And they'd say, why is it going up? And I go, well, it's because it's not going down. And they went, But what happens if it's wrong? And I go, well, if I buy it, it should go up, and it doesn't go up, then it is going down. I'll just do that as well. You know, I mean, you have to be a bit of a chameleon. But the truth was, you sort of feel it, and I think it's a bit like, you know, like I don't know whether you, and if you don't do this, you're very smart, but unfortunately I'm not that smart. So I play golf.
Right.
And golf swings are like dealing with, you know, in trading. You know, you can read every book and watch every YouTube video you like, but in the end, you kind of got to feel it. And if you just try and it's not an A plus B equals C thing. It's, you know, it's a feel, and that's what I think that it's like. But yeah, I mean, we live in a different world now. It's not open outcry, and it's quite. If you went into a major dealing room at JP Morgan Chase or something today, it would be quite different. But the principles aren't different.
No, it's still that instant barometer of world events and everything that's happening, isn't
absolutely.
it? Yeah. I mean, it was the kind of you know, a very glamorous era to be in, you know, on Wall Street and in the thick of it. Was it, you know, did you see that Wolf of Wall Street kind of excess, or was it a bit more down to earth?
No, it was like a lot of it was real and sort of like that, really. And you know, the tragic thing about it was that, you know, I hired a guy once. So when I left Elders Mitch Finance, I went to Bankers Trust. I worked out one day, by the way, brewing companies really shouldn't own, you know, you shouldn't be owning banks, and probably the Reserve Bank worked that out as well. And so I went off to Bankers Trust, and we were massive foreign exchange traders, you know, huge around the world, and the famous sort of Andy Krieger and, you know, kind of, you know, what's the money supply of New Zealand, and David Longy ringing up the head of Bankers Trust. And so I went there, and they were really, really huge. And there was a guy there, and he'd been the major trader in London, and he was getting about $3 million a year, maybe 3 or 4 million back in the late 80s and early 90s, and it was like phenomenal amounts of money. And years later, when I was running Merrill Lynch's global foreign exchange, I hired him. Yeah. And he had the various divorces and different things that cost a lot of money, and he'd spent enormous sums of money, right? You know, one day one of the trainees comes to me and says, oh, you know, something came out in the conversation, and she said, yeah, I've lent him some money. What do you mean you've lent him money? And she said, he needed £1,000 for something on Wednesday, so I lent it to him. And I thought, God, this guy has probably earned, I don't know, how many tens of millions of pounds. And you sort of sit there and you go, you know, and I would say to Max, you know, our son and our daughter, I go, we were so conservative back then. We were earning telephone numbers. Yeah. And we go out for dinner and we do some things that look like we were, you know, spending a bit of cash. But we were massively conservative. It's only really now, actually, that we've started, you know,
to feel comfortable spending some money.
I'd never think about flying anything other than the front of the plane, but back then we would think about it, you know, even though we were earning way more than, you know, we needed. So, but the truth was, I saw so many people that earned a lot of money and they had no idea, and they never thought the money was going to run out. And actually, my main economic advisor, brilliant guy, Grant Johnson, who was all my time when I was Prime Minister, he always used to say to me, the really interesting thing about the top personal tax rate is that you think that it's the same group of people that always earn it, but actually people come and go out of that rate, right? And they don't. Well,
yeah. Well, I was going to. One thing I do ask people on the podcast is what is the most indulgent purchase you've made? I mean, it sounds like it might not have been in that era.
No, it wasn't. Definitely wasn't in that era. If I'm really honest, I've just bought myself a helicopter because I've been learning to fly, and it's only a little helicopter. It's a very cute little one. It comes next year, so that. And I mean, look, I'm probably honest.
That's pretty exciting, but obviously that goes with a whole lifestyle of learning to fly one of these things.
Yeah, and then you can't rent them. You know, I mean, you can when you're learning, but you basically can't. So you actually end up thinking, well, I'm either not going to fly. So what do you do? So I bought one. So, but yeah, that's pretty indulgent. And my car's a Bentley, so that's pretty indulgent. But you know, I got enough to say it probably doesn't matter, so I can do it.
Yeah. Another question. I don't know if something springs to mind immediately, but what's the best advice about money you've ever been given?
Well, it might sound stupid, but live within your means. I think in reality, I always used to say about the country, if we spend more than we earn, eventually we go broke, And I think it's true in a household. And I think we live in a consumer world. They think about things like buy now, pay later. They flourish because we live in that society. And it's not just young millennials. Everyone wants everything now, but we tend to overspend. And what we don't realise is that when we're paying these massive amounts of interest and all, it's never getting ahead. So I know that I know we live in a world where we've got to borrow money to buy a house, but at least you've got to generally speaking, appreciate the asset. But live within your means, and the power of compound interest. Go there for 5 minutes one day and just write down what, and look at your KiwiSaver balance. Like they owe money right on our app. Don't know about the other banks, but on that app you can get your KiwiSaver and you can see your balance every day. And while it's not a perfect compound model, man, you can just see those charts of how over time. Berkshire Hathaway, go and have a look at Warren Buffett. It's amazing.
In actual fact, and putting the politics of it to one side, the whole debate about that KiwiSaver GST thing was heartening to some extent because New Zealanders could see, this, finally we had some sophisticated sort of...
Finally worked out,
this was $1 billion, which maybe we didn't have in 1975 or whenever we...
If we'd kept it back then, we might have been right. But anyway, former national leader, not me.
Fair enough. Do you get asked for money advice, and what sort of anything different you'd say other than the advice we just mentioned?
I get asked all the time. I always say to people, look, two things. If you have a student loan, make sure you finish your degree, because otherwise you have a liability in the form of a loan. You don't have the asset, which is the degree. And the second thing I always say is buy property. And so I know people will say, okay, well, that's all cool, but, it's a very hard thing to do, getting a deposit every day with the bank and mum and dad, and I get all that sort of stuff. But in reality, and it's not because I believe that it's so tax advantageous. I mean, there are some potential tax benefits, but what it does is, I think it's a form of massively forced saving. Firstly, you probably under normalised world, you shouldn't get the returns you've got in the last few years because that's crazy escalation in house prices. But just generally, you'll get a compound growth there. But it just makes you sit there, I think, and save. It makes you pay off some principal and interest in your loan. It just if you have some spare cash or a bonus or something, it makes you pay it off. And I reckon you look back one day and you go, wow, I've got all this stuff. And I know everybody tells a pollster, I'm outraged when house prices go up. Yeah. Do you reckon that's true? I reckon they're just telling the pulse that. I reckon they quietly sit there and go, Myrtle, we paid $200,000 for this house and we only owe 20 grand to the bank and now it's worth $1 million. And it's the wealth effect. They feel, they might say it's bad for my kids, but I reckon part of them is thinking this is quite cool. I'm worth a lot more money.
And it does have a big effect on the economy, doesn't it?
Sure it does. Yeah.
Also, it leads into another question, which I ask everyone on the podcast, which is framed pretty bluntly, but why, in the end, when it comes down to it, do you think some people are poor and some people are rich?
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously it's earning capacity. I sort of understand that, and sometimes it's choices. Like if you have a big family. Kids are just fundamentally really, really expensive if you think it through, which is, we want people to have children as a, sort of society. We need replacing our population needs. But that's one thing. I think it does sort of come down to people aren't always good at making logical decisions around money. And I've sort of seen kind of family members that have done things from time to time, not our kids or whatever, but they haven't always made really sensible decisions. They'll actually go and borrow money against something they probably don't really need because they've probably already got one of them and they're paying a lot of money for it and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's partly, what are your job opportunities, and it's partly it's luck and all those other things, but partly some people just consume a lot. And I reckon, we always joke, go out shopping, it's retail therapy, but there's a bit of that that's probably true. Sometimes people just sit there and go, I don't know, everything's sort of going a bit wrong. I feel a bit, life's a bit shitty, so stuff it. I'm going to go on a big holiday. And like when you go and borrow money from the bank and you improve your kitchen, then by the way, your house is worth a lot more and probably sell better. But when you borrow it to go to Florida to go on holiday, you're actually just kind of consuming.
Ethan's smiling.
Not that I don't want to, I just don't want to pick on your producer who's currently going to Florida on holiday. So, but you know what I mean? You understand what I mean?
And the debt can be a real trap too.
Well, that's been was my argument when I was Prime Minister, and some people agree and some people don't, but I reckon it's good debt and bad debt. If you're building infrastructure and you're investing in productivity and things, that's good debt. But if you're just basically spending on other stuff that's consumable, really it's bad debt eventually.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange one to ask a former Prime Minister, but I did ask Grant Robertson the same thing the other day, which is a question around, if you had all the power, what's the one thing you would really want to do to address poverty and lift New Zealand's economic performance? And I guess I'm acknowledging here that even as a Prime Minister or a Finance Minister, you don't have all the power.
You don't, yeah. Look, I think people get trapped in terrible sort of poverty traps sometimes. So if you think about today, I mean, we have enormous sums of people on welfare, and I don't mean that as a sort of political judgment statement. I mean, you can make the argument there were hundreds of thousands of people on welfare of some form when I was Prime Minister. And then, within those households, there's often a lot of existing debt, and then there's, there can be, drug and alcohol issues, and you throw all of these things in together, and people just get in the spiral and they can't get out of it. And so, if you really look at, I understand the working poor argument, but if you strip that out for a second, when they brought in welfare in New Zealand, Michael Joseph Savage famously, I think, said, this won't be an armchair ride to prosperity. Well, she was right about that. Like in the end, we might sit there and some people might say, oh, well, we don't want to give people welfare, but, and then they're doing it as a lifestyle option. Well, yeah, maybe they are, but for some people. But the reality is, they're immensely poor by most definitions when they're on that. So breaking people off welfare and into work is the single biggest thing you can do to actually lifting them out of poverty. Now, there are choices they can make along the way beyond that. Now, that's not always easy. Again, I sort of acknowledge there's lots of absolutely legitimate reasons why people can't, everything from mental health issues they might be suffering through to all sorts of other reasons. But if you really look at there's a big chunk of New Zealanders who are, by any international measure, quite poor. I think you'll find huge numbers of them are either on welfare or they've transitioned to New Zealand Super but come off extremely the meagre earnings prior to that, or frankly were on welfare prior to that.
Yeah. And I didn't want to get too much into politics, the political career, but when you look back at your time as PM, is there anything that, even with what you've learned and experienced in the last few years, anything that you would wish you could go back and redo or undo? Yeah,
it's not in the money space, but in the back end of when I was Prime Minister, I wanted to do a big cancer facility. So I wanted to do the equivalent of Starship for cancer. And the reason I wanted to do it was that I thought that, we have some tremendous, services and capability in New Zealand, and I kind of acknowledge them in different places and different things. But when I look around the world, I mean, I think our surgeons and medical staff are fantastic. And largely for the cookie cutter stuff you need, what's different about this and say going off to Sloan Kettering, say in the US, would just be probably their access to experimental drugs and things that aren't being, say, trialled in New Zealand. But even so, I've through both kind of, family experiences and things, realised, there's a lot in the system that's really found wanting. And you go and have a look at these debates around Pharmac and what drugs are actually funding, and so I had this view that we should just do this incredible sort of, wraparound, and it's kind of everything. More
the idea of just championing something.
Yeah, and I got talked out of it. I mean, we did more in different things, but if I had my time again, I'd do it because I think that generations of New Zealanders would eventually look back and say that was a really good good. That was a good use of our taxpayer dollars.
Yeah. Hey, look, I'll wrap it up here, but I just finally, I guess, it's a big question, but when you look at the New Zealand economy now, the politics of the nuts and bolts aside, how do you think we're looking? Are we going to be all right?
Oh, look, one level I can tell you from an ANZ perspective, we have been absolutely stunned that we haven't seen more write-offs, more collapses, all this stuff. Yeah, in certain sectors, hospitality, some recently actually found out in construction, we see some stress and we see some failures. And it's been really, really tough for a lot of these small businesses. But overall, they've coped incredibly well, partly because the government's poured in huge amounts of resources and Reserve Bank's done the same, and there's been big programs and things. So, I think actually, we're starting to see them draw down more on their facilities at the moment. Households, again, as well, we're seeing a little more stress there, but it's still been incredibly resilient. And you think about how tight the labour markets are. So I'm not all doom and gloom about New Zealand, but I just sort of think two things. One, I worry a lot about the level of indebtedness. I just worry that at some point, interest rates rise and, and they're doing that already, and we roll off these, just borrowing, and we're going to have to pay higher levels of debt servicing. And that was a massive problem for governments in the 80s and 90s. And the second thing I worry about, which is probably even more immediate, we seem to have convinced ourselves that we kind of don't want to be internationally connected. We don't want migrants coming to New Zealand. We almost kind of don't want tourists coming. We don't want foreign students. And I was massively pro-migration when I was Prime Minister. And look, with the geographical size of Great Britain, we've got 5 million people. Don't tell me we can't cope with a few more people. And you look at these young people that come here on working holiday programs, and they're fantastic workers. And, migrants that come from India and China and stuff, they give up huge amounts and they come here to make a life. And I just think as New Zealanders, we should say, what do we want? We want to be a little Silicon Valley. We want to attract the best from around the world. We've got nothing to be fearful of that, and a lot to be gained by that. So that, to me, I think is areas to think about. But look, we're an incredibly blessed country. We've got great people, good education system, and very arable land and climatic conditions. So I don't think we're going broke anytime soon.
That's a good place to wrap up. Sir John Key, thank you very much for your time and the interview. Cheers.
Liam, thanks very much. Enjoyed it.
Cheers. And thanks for listening. If you've got feedback, drop me a line at liam.dan@nzherald.co.nz. And if you want to hear more of these, please subscribe at iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts.